Hello and a very warm welcome. India is gearing up for what's being described as a once-in-a-100-year budget. Well, we don't know what the budget will contain, but we do know the kind of problems cumulatively that the government and the country are dealing with at this time are once-in-a-century problems. A pandemic which is hopefully now on its way out, but you can't be 100% certain about that. Military aggression by China, which again requires huge focus on defense, and economy which is seen a downturn which is unprecedented, even though the IMF now projects that India will grow in double digits next year. But these are huge challenges. Challenges when it comes to revenue collection, challenges when it comes to government expenditure. Given so many different requirements, where should the Indian government and the finance minister really be concentrating their energy so that we can get the maximum bang for every Indian buck? Joining me on this India Today-CII special conversation in the build-up to the Union Budget of 2021, I want to welcome first Mr. Uday Kotak, President of the Confederation of Indian Industry, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Kotak Mahindra Bank. With us on this broadcast is Dr. Pawan Goenka. He's the Managing Director and CEO of Mahindra. In Mahindra, he also leads CII's mission on an Atmanirbhar Bharat. We have Puneet Chhatwal, who runs Indian Hotels companies as its MD and CEO. And last but not least, we have Chandrajit Banerjee, Director General of CII, who's been speaking to stakeholders across industries to get a sense of where effort and energy should be concentrated. I want to kickstart this conversation by asking Uday Kotak about what you think, not just from the prism of Indian industry, but from the prism of national interest, would be the best way for Nirmala Sitharaman to be prioritizing her effort in the build-up to what is being called a once-in-a-100-year budget. Do you see it like that, or is it just unnecessary hype? Because very often we see budgets getting hyped up, sometimes much more than is actually needed.
We've got to keep in mind that the pandemic has happened 100 years later, and therefore it is the first budget after a pandemic which at least our generation has not seen. Therefore, to that extent, it is clearly a budget which is happening on the backdrop of the pandemic. 5 key areas of focus, as I see from a national interest and prioritization point of view: infrastructure, healthcare, defense, education, and sustainability. All the 5 critical areas for our future. And I include sustainability in this category. Please keep in mind that the world axis is going to change even faster on sustainability with the change of the administration in the United States. Therefore, if we focus on these 5 big areas, I think India would be in a better place in the next 3 to 5 years if we execute well on these.
Chandrajit Banerjee, one of the points that CII and other industry bodies have made again and again is that there hasn't been enough focus on government expenditure. So far, the government said, let's try and get out of this pandemic cycle, and that's when we'll open our purse strings. We want to keep our powder dry. Why is it that you believe that the budget is the right opportunity for the government to unleash its spending power, and how would you like to see the money being spent?
One of the things that we really want to happen now is to see how we can get demand really pushed up, and that's the way, and that's going to be therefore still I would say government-led spending, and I think government would have to lead that in in terms of infrastructure and the type of priorities Uday just mentioned. And I think we would like to see government leadership in all of this. And this will be very, very critical from the point of view of, say, for instance, a part of it would, as I mentioned, would be on infrastructure. But we need to see outlays to be seen in areas like healthcare, where we see a roadmap towards going towards a 3%, or a huge focus on even areas like defense or education, for that matter. And I think one of the biggest priorities of the budget would have to be of course, creating demand. And one of the things, of course, would be also to put employment as a number one. And employment to be put as one of the things, as I mentioned, infrastructure, which leads to construction, which is a big generator of employment. So I would think that it's going to be a lot of close look given to how the government really looks at spending in this budget, which will in turn generate demand, which will in turn generate employment. And I think that's what's going to be watched. And private sector slowly will obviously kick in, because we are seeing demand rise, we are seeing capacity utilization growing. And as the capacity utilization reaches 75%, industry will also plan investment, provided we have a few things taken care of. So I would imagine that this, as we really look at a very strong, this year is going, the budget also would really need to be looking at the next 2 to 3 years, in fact 3 to 4 years. So it's not just this year, it will have to plan for next year, when our growth would be comparable with the growth of next year to that of in 2019. So I would think that a solid amount of planning needs to go, and a solid amount of roadmap needs to be put in terms of government expenditure.
Pawan Goenka, you head up the Atmanirbhar mission at CII. What's your sense of how successful Atmanirbhar India has been over the past several months in the middle of this pandemic, and what would you like to see in terms of policies, in terms of incentives from the government to speed up and help make the idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat more successful?
So let me just preface that by saying that the issue that is in front of the Honorable Finance Minister this time is no different than what the companies face when we are going through difficult time. That is, how do we manage our short term without compromising with the long term? And that's what both Chandrajit and Uday have talked about, to keep the focus on education, on healthcare, on environment. But at the same time, we need to generate demand for the next 12 months. And once demand happens, everything else like investment, like employment will fall in place by itself. On the very specific question of Atmanirbhar Bharat, what I can say is that the resolve is real. Whether you talk to industry, you talk to government departments, you talk to anyone, the resolve is real. Having said that, the kind of things that we need to do to make Atmanirbhar Bharat reality will not be just incremental change from how we have been doing business. We will have to make some disruptions. If I take manufacturing specifically, we find that in many sectors in manufacturing, India has a cost disability of 8 to 10% because of various factor costs, whether it's power, labor, capital, or whatever it might be. And we need to find a way of making that 8 to 10% disability go away. Till that happens, we will have to depend on artificial barriers to create Atmanirbharta, which is not desirable. We need to make Indian industry more competitive. And I would say the biggest step that the government of India has announced towards that is the PLI scheme for the 3+10 sectors. And therefore, what I would like to see in the budget is to make this PLI scheme, clearly roll it out during the budget, make it simple to use, with the intention of spending that 150,000 crore and not saving that money, because more we spend on PLI, more manufacturing will grow, more investment will happen, more employment will happen. So therefore, a lot of work has to be done, both by the industry and by the government, to really bring Atmanirbharta. It can happen, but it will not happen easily. It will not happen by incremental changes. We will have to make some disruptive changes in the way we work, the way we govern, control, the ease of doing business, cost of doing business. All of these things have to be looked at threadbare and not at the helicopter level, but at the ground level on how do we make each one of these things happen.
Puneet Chatwal, the hospitality sector has been amongst the worst hit through this pandemic-stricken year. To what extent do you believe, as a sector, hospitality has already been able to recover? And to speed up the process of recovery, what would you like to hear and see from the Finance Minister?
Thank you, Rahul. I think what you said, it would be fair to say it's not amongst the most. I think tourism and hospitality is the worst hit sector across the globe. Having said that, I think it's also not any secret that this sector provides the maximum employment. So what Dr. Goenka and Mr. Banerjee said, that if employment has to be one of the key pillars and to stimulate demand, there is a huge opportunity to create employment for the young population in India, because a lot of people have not only lost jobs, but the opportunity provided will be the single biggest multiplicator of jobs, creating demand in all other sectors. I definitely agree that we can't lose the long-term focus, but there is an opportunity now as we are getting to lower and lower numbers on the new cases of COVID. There is less likelihood of having a mutation of the virus in India because every channel is talking about herd immunity. And if that's the case, it's a good time to somehow reflect in the budget three key issues of supporting a sector that can support the growth of a nation. That is from a policy perspective, from a tax perspective, and creating a stimulus to, to fulfill the vision of the Honorable Prime Minister of Dekho Apna Desh. And there is no better way to do it than by supporting tourism and the hospitality sector.
So let's now try and get into some of your areas of specialization, and I want to start with Uday Kotak and get his thoughts on revenue mobilization, because at a time when the government wants to spend more on public infrastructure, on healthcare, at a time when the economy is recovering, but at the speed that it isn't a very quick recovery. It's a purposeful recovery, but a slow recovery. Given this reality and the reality that you now need to spend more on military modernization on account of continuing Chinese military aggression along the entire line of actual control, what would be your ideas, Mr. Kotak, on how the government should try and mop up more revenue and find more fuel to try and spend on its various programs and requirements?
Divide it in two parts: tax revenue and non-tax revenue. On the tax revenue, our view is keep tax rates stable, let growth happen on tax collections through economic growth coming back. Non-tax revenues, disproportionate focus needs to be there. And on that, let's first start with what we have historically called disinvestment. We should now be bolder and go on the front foot on privatization of many areas. The government has already mentioned that there are non-strategic areas where it will go for privatization. Time has come to really get a high focus, high purpose, high execution approach to privatization. And in many ways, some of the stuff which we saw when Maggie Thatcher did it in the 80s in the UK. So really get down to surgical cutting-edge education.
No, but privatization is some, but sir, with a lot of respect, disinvestment and privatization of the kind that Margaret Thatcher did has been a wish list of industry from time immemorial. Every year we say it, including in the last year, where of course things were tougher because of the pandemic. But so far we haven't seen the execution or the delivery. We've seen intent, we've seen noises, but we haven't seen delivery. If it hasn't happened so far, how can you be so confident that this can be one of the key pillars from where you're able to mop up more revenue?
Rahul, one of the points which we learn in running companies is, yes, strategy is important. Finally, making things happen is about execution. Therefore, we need to get our execution and make it happen. So that is one. And therefore, if you say that we cannot execute, then there are many things which we have a challenge with. But we have to really get to cutting edge execution on the area of privatization. And in Indian context, it is also brings us to the point that many things take very long. I am a believer, and something I've told on your channel, return on time invested, ROTI, get it short, move it fast and execute. So one is privatization. Second is land. I have heard for ages the amount of government land which we have. Why is it that we cannot, whether it's state governments or central government, why is it that we cannot put our minds and heads together and focus on high quality execution of sale of land and create a non-tax revenue? What holds us back? If the nation has so much land which is unproductive and which can be put to productive use, why not? Third, areas out of the box. India has the largest reserves of probably gold anywhere in the world. What are we doing with that gold? Whether it is in the hands of private individuals or the state, it's a national wealth. How are we converting that to a productive asset and taking care of our fisc? We need money for health, defense, infrastructure. That is where our priority must be. So there are many pockets of money stuck in assets which we need to execute at scale and speed. We cannot forever say that, it's going to take us endless time and therefore not waste our time. If we do that, then we are basically taking away from future generations by borrowing unnecessarily and leaving behind disproportionate borrowing for the future generations.
We're also seeing this budget come at a time when the national capital has been rocked by the farmer protests, especially in Punjab and Haryana. Chandrajit Banerjee, there's been a pushback on the most ambitious reform package of the Modi government. Before this, during the pandemic, we saw reform measures introduced in land purchase. We saw some talk of administrative reform and more promise of big bang reform in time to come. But given the political blowback from parts of the farming community to the government's agrarian reform, do you think this will impact the government's appetite for bigger, more audacious reform going forward? Because here, while the execution may be questioned, the intent was largely in the right direction, but they're dealing with the political consequences and having to pay for it. So do you think this could impact short to medium term appetite and desire for big bang reform, which you'd be very keen on, CB?
So, Rahul, yes, of course, we should, number one, see this also go through in some format or the other. I mean, I'm still hopeful, and I'm sure there would be things happening over the next few days to see how reforms are not stalled. And I would really hope that there are major reforms which this government has initiated. And one of the ways why you talked about once in a 100-year budget, there are many reasons for believing it. But to see this budget to be something which we have seen in 1991 or 97, a lot of it would have to do with reforms. And I would really want the government, which has been known for some bold steps and bold reforms, that should continue, and this budget to show certain important reforms and certain important directions as far as the budget goes in terms of reforms.
Pawan Goenka, have you been thinking about trying to bridge this gap between the need for reform philosophically and creating a public appetite for consuming that reform? Because the agrarian reform package is a classical example of reforms which in the long run will definitely yield results, or hopefully will yield results, but in the short term are seeing this big pushback. And even though you may not like to accept it, the reality is that government will be chastened by the blowback and would next time when they're coming up with a reform package think that much harder about how to try and make it more palatable for the end consumer, which could take away from how key or how big or how massive that reform package is and the extent to which it goes to bring about reform.
Well, I would, obviously it's a very, very complex topic, Rahul, and Chandrajit has talked about it. Now, I'm sure that the intent always has been of the government to do the right thing, and in this particular case also, the farm laws that are currently under question have been put in with the right intent. And undoubtedly, there is a lesson learned for everyone in this. And the government, I'm sure, is introspecting on how it could have been executed better so that we don't run into the kind of problems that we are running into. But as Chandrajit said, that our country needs major reforms in many areas, not just in farm. And I hope that this experience that is happening right now, or the incident that's happening right now, does not become a roadblock for major reforms to come. And if we don't have major reforms, we will never be able to get the economic prosperity that we are looking for.
I was moderating a session at the World Economic Forum where one of the things that was mentioned by one of our panelists from Geneva, who runs a massive HR consultancy, is that their apprehension is, especially in the context of Europe and America, that when governments start stopping the current doles and the handouts and the economic lease of life that's been extended to companies, because at some point in time the pandemic relief packages will come to an end. They apprehend that there could be massive job losses, and lots of companies may shut shop, or they'll have to contract their businesses in terms of employment very significantly. To what extent do you think that threat or that fear extends to India, and what do you believe this budget should do to try and focus on the critical issue of employment in the context of how bad it's been through this pandemic already, and what could happen going forward? Mr. Kotak.
Rahul, the CII theme for this year is about lives and livelihood in the context of getting growth back. First, on the COVID side, we have done pretty well in recent times on lives. The active cases have come down. We've got now the vaccine going. Therefore, hopefully, the story on COVID should get over sometime in 21, and hopefully it is behind us. But it has left behind a very big challenge on livelihoods. And it is here that one of the major policy initiatives I look forward to in this budget is how are we going to get jobs back, both as jobs for self-employed as well as for employment in business, working for companies. And here I think we need a specific fiscal push. There is a section in the Income Tax Act called Section 80JJAA, which rewards businesses and companies which hire net new people. We need to give a booster dose to that in this budget, so that enterprise which hires new people gets a significant incentive for getting job market going. So that is the short-term thing. The longer-term thing is about education and skills. The nature of jobs is changing. We need to look at areas of technology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence. We need to focus on getting those skill sets and getting to better quality jobs.
Pawan Goenka, in conclusion, your ideas as a key generator of employment on this apprehension that international consultants seem to have about huge job losses. Have we already been through that period, because income support wasn't quite as strong or as generous in India as it was elsewhere, and therefore the belief that in Europe and America companies kept employees going because they got the dole from the government, and then when that stops is when they'll have to deal with the crisis, whereas in India they've already dealt with the crisis. Is that your perception, or do you think that going forward we could still continue to have to deal with job losses, and what is your prescription on dealing with that?
Well, I think here again we have to separate out the short term and the long term. In the long term, the only way to have high employment will be to have high requirement of people. If somebody came to my company and said, just go ahead and hire more people by creating inefficiency, that is the sure short way of the company going under. We have to run the company very efficiently and not just have people with sort of underutilized time. And therefore, as I said earlier, that the only way to get employment in the long term is to have demand, whether it is for service, whether it is for hospitality, whether it is for products. And that's what we need to focus on. Demand has to come from domestic consumption. Demand has to come from improving export. But in the short term, because of the crisis that we have had, there is a need to support employment by virtue of giving some kind of incentive for companies to provide employment. But that cannot be a long-term solution. Maybe 3 more months, 6 more months, but finally it has to be demand. And therefore my single agenda for the budget this time would be to see what is being done to stimulate demand, whether it's service industry, hospitality, including service, in the service, of course, and whether it is the manufacturing industry.
So we've had an insightful conversation. We've been able to touch upon different aspects of generating demand, generating revenue so that the government has money to be able to spend on its various projects, and also ensuring employment, which is key, because lives and livelihoods are what will determine how everyone feels about where we are and where we are headed. I want to thank Chandrajit Banerjee, Puneet Chatwal, Pawan Goenka, and last but not least Uday Kotak for joining us for this special conversation. And I hope to have you back on the day of the budget to see how many of the ideas and the prescriptions that you laid out were actually followed and what you think of what the Finance Minister ended up doing. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I'll have more for you on the other side of a quick break. Back in a moment.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.